The year was 1816, and London society moved like clockwork through its elaborate rituals of refinement. In the grand drawing rooms of Mayfair, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across silk wallpaper, the season dictated every breath, every glance, every carefully orchestrated moment of aristocratic life. Lady Beatrice Pemberton, the 23-year-old Duchess of Ashworth, stood before the towering windows of Pemberton House, watching carriages roll past in the afternoon sun. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman whose curves defied the fashionable silhouette of the empire waist, whose presence commanded attention not for her conformity to beauty standards, but for the intelligence that blazed in her dark eyes and the dignity with which she carried herself despite society's whispered judgments. "Beatrice, step away from that window this instant," came the sharp voice of her father, Charles Pemberton, the Duke of Ashworth. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor as he approached, his expression bearing the perpetual disappointment that had defined their relationship since her debut 3 seasons ago. "Lady Worthington's carriage just passed, and I will not have you displayed like some merchant's daughter pressing your nose against glass." The Duke was a man whose entire existence revolved around appearances, bloodlines, and the intricate web of social connections that elevated the Pemberton name above reproach. At 58, his silver hair was meticulously groomed, his posture military straight, and his expectations for his only daughter as rigid as the whalebone corsets that tortured fashionable ladies. "Forgive me, father," Beatrice replied, her voice carrying the measured politeness that had become her armor. "I was merely observing the architectural renovations being conducted across the square. The new Georgian additions are quite remarkable." "Architecture," the Duke scoffed, adjusting his emerald cravat pin with sharp, irritated movements. "You would do better to observe the ladies emerging from those carriages and learn something about proper deportment. Lady Amelia Harrington received 3 proposals last week alone, and she is 2 years younger than you." The criticism struck its intended mark. Beatrice had endured 3 London seasons without a single serious suitor, despite her substantial dowry and prestigious title. The whispered conversations that followed her through ballrooms were not about her intelligence, her charitable works, or her skill at the pianoforte, but about her failure to embody the delicate, ethereal beauty that society demanded of its aristocratic daughters. "Perhaps," Beatrice said carefully, "compatibility in marriage involves more than physical appearance. Shared interests, intellectual conversation, mutual respect." "Mutual respect," her father interrupted with a bitter laugh, "comes from knowing one's place in society and fulfilling one's duty to family honor. Your romantic notions of precisely would have left you unwed at 23, becoming the subject of drawing-room gossip throughout London." The Duke moved to his writing desk, a massive mahogany piece adorned with gold leaf, and retrieved a letter bearing an elaborate wax seal. "Which brings me to a matter of urgent importance. Lord Blackwood has written with a proposition that will solve the embarrassment you have become to the Pemberton name." Beatrice felt her stomach tighten with dread. Lord Blackwood was a man of 62 whose first 2 wives had died under mysterious circumstances, whose gambling debts were whispered about in gentlemen's clubs, and whose reputation for cruelty towards servants was legendary among the household staff of London's great houses. "He has graciously offered to consider you as his 3rd wife," the Duke continued, breaking the seal with deliberate ceremony. "Despite your unconventional appearance and advanced age, he recognizes the value of our family connections and your generous dowry settlement." "Father, surely you cannot be serious." Beatrice's composure cracked, revealing the desperation beneath her careful facade. "Lord Blackwood is known throughout London for his violent temper and dissolute lifestyle. His previous wives fulfilled their duty by providing him with sons and maintaining his household," the Duke snapped. "Their deaths were unfortunate circumstances that have no bearing on this advantageous alliance. You will meet with Lord Blackwood tomorrow evening at the Worthington Ball, and you will comport yourself with a gratitude befitting a woman of your circumstances." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom. Beatrice understood that her father's patience had reached its limit, that her failure to secure an appropriate marriage had become an intolerable burden on the family reputation. In a society where a woman's worth was measured entirely by her ability to attract and retain a husband, she had been weighed and found wanting. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. The Duke's expression grew cold as winter frost. "Then you will discover exactly how limited your options truly are. The Pemberton name will not be further tarnished by your romantic fantasies and stubborn pride. You will marry Lord Blackwood, where you will find yourself removed from this house and society entirely, left to contemplate your foolishness in considerably reduced circumstances." The threat was clear. Accept a marriage that would likely result in misery or death, or face complete social exile and financial ruin. In 1816, a woman without family support had virtually no means of survival, and the Duke knew this reality would force his daughter into compliance. Beatrice stood in silence, feeling the weight of 23 years of disappointment, criticism, and conditional love pressing down upon her shoulders. Through the window, she could see the construction workers across the square, men whose labor built the magnificent structures that housed London's elite, yet who would never be permitted to enter those buildings as guests. The irony was not lost on her that she, despite her title and fortune, felt more kinship with those workers than with the aristocratic society that judged her so harshly. Like them, she was valued only for what she could provide, not for who she truly was beneath the surface. As evening descended over London, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Beatrice retreated to her private chambers on the third floor of Pemberton House. Her lady's maid, Mrs. Margaret Clark, was arranging fresh roses in a crystal vase, her weathered hands gentle with the delicate blooms. "Your Grace appears troubled this evening," Mrs. Clark observed, her Scottish accent softening the words with genuine concern. She had served the Pemberton family for nearly 20 years and had watched Beatrice grow from a spirited child into a woman burdened by expectations she could never hope to fulfill. "Father has arranged my marriage to Lord Blackwood," Beatrice said simply, sinking into the velvet chair beside her writing desk. The words felt strange on her tongue, as if she were recounting someone else's tragedy rather than her own fate. Mrs. Clark's hands stilled on the roses, her face reflecting the horror that Beatrice felt but could not express. "Your Grace, surely there must be some alternative. Lord Blackwood's reputation is precisely why Father believes him willing to overlook my deficiencies," Beatrice finished with bitter humor. "A desperate man for a desperate woman. Father considers it a fair exchange." The older woman moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper as if the walls themselves might betray their conversation. "There are always alternatives, Your Grace, though they may require courage that society tells us ladies should not possess." Before Beatrice could ask what she meant, the sound of carriages approaching the house drew their attention to the window. Below, elegantly dressed guests were arriving for one of her stepmother's intimate dinner parties, the kind of glittering social event that defined London's season. Among the arriving guests, Beatrice noticed a figure who stood out from the usual parade of titled aristocrats. A tall man with dark hair and clothes that, while well-tailored, lacked the ostentatious display of wealth favored by most of London's elite. He moved with quiet confidence, his gaze taking in the architectural details of the house with obvious appreciation and professional interest. "Who is that gentleman arriving with Lord and Lady Worthington?" Beatrice asked, leaning closer to the window. Mrs. Clark joined her at the glass, squinting at the figure below. "That would be Mr. James Worthington, Your Grace. Lady Worthington's younger brother. He's an architect by trade, been working on several important projects throughout London." An architect, a man who created beauty and permanence through skill and vision rather than inheritance and title. Beatrice found herself intrigued despite her emotional turmoil. In a world where men were valued for their bloodlines and women for their beauty, here was someone whose worth came from his talent and dedication to craft. I believe he's been overseeing the renovations to several grand houses this season, Mrs. Clark continued. The Worthingtons are quite proud of his accomplishments, though some in society find his profession rather commercial. The dismissive term revealed everything about London's aristocratic priorities. Trade, no matter how skilled or profitable, was considered beneath the dignity of true gentlemen, who were expected to live entirely off inherited wealth and family investments. As Beatrice watched, Mr. Worthington paused on the front steps, looking up at the facade of Pemberton House with obvious admiration for its architectural merits. For a brief moment, his gaze seemed to find her window, and even from this distance, she felt an unexpected jolt of connection. Then the moment passed, and he disappeared into the house with the other guests, leaving Beatrice with a strange sense of loss and an unfamiliar flutter of curiosity about a man who saw beauty in stone and mortar rather than titles and dowries. The contrast between Mr. Worthington's quiet confidence and Lord Blackwood's predatory reputation could not have been more stark, and for the first time since her father's ultimatum, Beatrice felt a spark of defiance kindle in her chest. Tomorrow evening would bring the Worthington ball and her formal introduction to the man who expected to claim her as his third wife. But tonight, knowing that just floors below her, a different kind of man sat at her father's table, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be valued for something other than her compliance and her dowry. The roses Mrs. Clark had arranged seemed to glow in the candlelight, their beauty natural and unpretentious, requiring no artifice or enhancement to command admiration. Perhaps, Beatrice thought with growing determination, there were others who might appreciate beauty in its authentic form rather than demanding conformity to narrow, arbitrary standards. As the sounds of conversation and laughter drifted up from the dinner party below, Beatrice began to plan not for submission to her father's will, but for the possibility of a future she had never dared to envision. The following morning brought autumn's crisp embrace to London, with golden light streaming through the tall windows of Pemberton House's breakfast room. Beatrice sat at the polished mahogany table, absently stirring her tea while contemplating the array of social obligations that filled her day. The Morning Post had brought 3 invitations to tea parties, 2 requests for charitable patronage, and a note from Lord Blackwood expressing his eager anticipation of their meeting at the Worthington ball. "Your Grace seems particularly thoughtful this morning," observed Mrs. Clark as she entered with fresh flowers for the table arrangement. "Perhaps a walk in the garden might improve your spirits before this afternoon's social calls." Before Beatrice could respond, her stepmother, Lady Catherine Pemberton, swept into the room in a rustle of morning silk and barely contained disapproval. At 38, Catherine was everything Beatrice was not: petite, ethereally blonde, and possessed of the kind of fragile beauty that inspired men to write terrible poetry and fight duels over imagined slights. "Beatrice, darling," Catherine said with the syrupy tone she employed when delivering criticism disguised as concern, "I must speak with you about your appearance for this evening's ball. Your usual dramatic style simply will not suffice for such an important occasion." The word dramatic was Catherine's polite way of referencing Beatrice's curves, which refused to conform to the fashionable silhouette no matter how tightly her corset was laced or how skillfully her gowns were constructed. "I had planned to wear my emerald silk," Beatrice replied carefully. "It coordinates beautifully with the Pemberton emeralds." "Oh, my dear," Catherine sighed with exaggerated sympathy, settling into her chair with the graceful precision of a woman who had never struggled with the physical realities of occupying space in a world designed for smaller bodies. "We must be so much more strategic than that. Lord Blackwood has particular preferences, and we must present you in the most flattering possible light." The implication was clear. Beatrice required extensive management to be even minimally acceptable to a man desperate enough to consider her as a wife. Catherine produced a small leather journal from her reticule and opened it with the ceremony of a general planning a military campaign. I have consulted with Madame Du Bois about alterations to your existing gowns, Catherine continued, referencing London's most exclusive French dressmaker. She suggests strategic draping to minimize your proportions and perhaps a higher neckline to maintain appropriate modesty. Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks at the casual cruelty of the conversation. Every word reinforced the message that her natural form was somehow shameful, requiring concealment and apology rather than acceptance or pride. Additionally, Catherine pressed on relentlessly, we must discuss your behavior this evening. None of your usual intellectual conversations or opinions about architecture and literature. Lord Blackwood prefers ladies who are decorative rather than challenging. The breakfast room's cheerful morning light seemed to dim as Beatrice contemplated an evening of self-erasure, followed by a lifetime of the same. She was expected to transform herself into a meek, silent ornament, valuable only for her dowry and her willingness to overlook her future husband's documented cruelties. A soft knock at the door interrupted Catherine's lecture, and the butler, Mr. Harrison, entered with his usual dignified bearing. Your Grace, he addressed Beatrice with the respect due her rank. There is a gentleman caller requesting an audience. Mr. James Worthington wishes to discuss architectural consultations for the estate renovations His Grace mentioned last evening. Beatrice felt her pulse quicken unexpectedly. The architect from the previous evening's dinner party, the man whose quiet confidence had intrigued her from her window perch, was here in her home. Architectural consultations? Catherine's voice rose with barely concealed horror. Surely such matters are for your father to handle. A lady has no business discussing building projects with tradesmen. Mr. Worthington is hardly a common tradesman, Beatrice replied with more authority than she had used in months. He is Lady Worthington's brother and a respected professional. If father mentioned renovations, it would be discourteous to refuse his time. Catherine's protests were overruled by the arrival of the Duke himself, who entered the breakfast room with the morning newspapers tucked under his arm and an expression of pleased calculation on his aristocratic features. Ah, excellent, he declared upon hearing of Mr. Worthington's presence. I have been meaning to commission improvements to the estate grounds. The man comes highly recommended, and his fees are surprisingly reasonable for someone with connections to the Worthington family. The Duke's approval was based entirely on practical considerations. Mr. Worthington's work would enhance the property's value, while his family connections made him socially acceptable, despite his commercial profession. Beatrice, the Duke continued with unusual geniality, you may receive Mr. Worthington in the morning room and discuss the preliminary details. Your knowledge of the house's history and your artistic sensibilities might prove useful in explaining our requirements. The suggestion was so unexpected that Beatrice nearly dropped her teacup. Her father, who typically excluded her from all business matters, was actually inviting her participation in a professional consultation. Catherine looked as if she had witnessed a violation of natural law. Charles, surely it would be more appropriate for you to handle such matters directly. Ladies should not involve themselves in commercial discussions. Mr. Worthington is Lady Worthington's brother, the Duke replied dismissively. His presence here is as much social courtesy as business necessity. Beatrice can provide the initial consultation while I attend to more pressing matters. 15 minutes later, Beatrice found herself in the morning room, smoothing her blue muslin dress and attempting to calm her inexplicably racing heart. The room was one of her favorites in the house, with its cream-colored walls adorned with family portraits and tall windows that looked out over the carefully maintained gardens. When Mr. Harrison announced Mr. Worthington's arrival, Beatrice rose with as much dignity as she could manage, despite feeling suddenly self-conscious about her appearance and her complete lack of experience with professional consultations. James Worthington entered the morning room with the easy confidence she had observed from her window, but up close, his presence was even more compelling. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet in height, with dark brown hair that showed traces of bronze in the morning light and eyes the color of warm amber. His clothing was impeccably tailored but understated, speaking of good taste rather than ostentatious wealth. "Your Grace," he said with a bow that was respectful without being obsequious, "I am honored by your willingness to discuss your family's architectural requirements. Lady Worthington speaks most highly of your knowledge regarding historical architecture." His voice carried traces of northern England, suggesting origins less aristocratic than his current social position, but his manner was that of a man comfortable in any setting. When he straightened from his bow, his eyes met hers directly, without the calculating assessment she was accustomed to receiving from men evaluating her marriageability. "Please, Mr. Worthington, be seated," Beatrice replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I understand you're considering projects for our estate grounds. I confess myself curious about your architectural philosophy." As they settled into chairs positioned near the windows, Beatrice noticed that James's attention seemed genuinely focused on their conversation rather than cataloging her physical deficiencies or calculating her dowry value. It was such an unusual experience that she felt momentarily disoriented. "Architecture," James said with obvious passion, warming his voice, "should enhance the natural beauty of its setting while serving the practical needs of those who inhabit the space. Too often, grand houses are designed purely for ostentation, with little consideration for comfort or harmony with the landscape. You believe in functional beauty rather than mere display?" Beatrice asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. The concept resonated deeply with her own frustrated relationship with appearance and social expectations. "Precisely," James replied, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "A building should be honest about its purpose and materials, rather than disguising its true nature beneath unnecessary ornamentation. The most beautiful structures I have encountered achieve elegance through proportion and craftsmanship rather than excessive decoration." The parallel to human beauty was so obvious that Beatrice felt her cheeks warm with recognition. Here was a man who valued authenticity over artifice, substance over superficial display. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "you might share your vision for improvements to our grounds." Father mentioned enhancing the property's natural features rather than imposing dramatic changes. James withdrew a leather portfolio from his satchel and opened it to reveal detailed sketches and notes. As he spread the drawings across the small table between them, Beatrice caught glimpses of his work. Elegant garden pavilions that seemed to grow naturally from their landscapes, walkways that followed the land's natural contours, and architectural elements that complemented rather than dominated their surroundings. "Your estate possesses remarkable natural advantages," James explained, pointing to a detailed site plan. "The terrace gardens could be enhanced with stone pathways that follow the existing slopes, creating intimate spaces for contemplation while maintaining views of the greater landscape." As he spoke, his hands moved expressively over the drawings, and Beatrice found herself watching his fingers trace architectural details with obvious love for his craft. There was something deeply attractive about a man who created beauty through skill and vision rather than simply inheriting it. "You have an artist's eye for beauty," she observed, then immediately felt self-conscious about the personal nature of her comment. James looked up from his drawings, meeting her gaze directly once again. "Beauty exists in many forms, Your Grace. Society often demands conformity to narrow standards, but true beauty emerges from authenticity, character, and the courage to remain genuine despite external pressures." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond architectural discussion. Beatrice felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that this man saw the world through eyes unclouded by society's arbitrary judgments. "You speak as someone who has encountered such pressures yourself," she said softly. "A man who earns his living through trade, regardless of family connections, learns quickly that society values titles over talent." James replied with a rueful smile. I have been fortunate to find patrons who appreciate craftsmanship, but I'm always aware of my position as someone tolerated rather than truly accepted. The honesty of his admission created an unexpected intimacy between them. Here were two people who understood what it meant to be valued for the wrong reasons or dismissed for failing to meet arbitrary expectations. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of tea service presented by Mrs. Clark with her usual efficiency and a barely perceptible smile of approval as she observed their animated discussion. "Mr. Worthington," Beatrice said as they paused for refreshment, "I find myself curious about your training. Did you study architecture formally, or did you develop your skills through practical experience?" "Both, Your Grace," James replied, accepting his teacup with appreciation. "I was apprenticed to a master builder in Yorkshire as a boy, then later studied classical architecture in Italy for 2 years. The combination of practical construction knowledge and theoretical understanding has served me well." "Italy," Beatrice repeated with undisguised longing. "I have dreamed of seeing the architectural wonders of Rome and Florence since I was a child. The descriptions in travel accounts seem almost magical." "No description can capture the reality," James said with obvious pleasure at her interest. Standing beneath the dome of St. Peter's or watching sunlight play across the facade of the Duomo in Florence, architecture becomes poetry written in stone and light. For the next hour, they discussed architectural history, design philosophy, and James's experiences traveling throughout Europe in pursuit of knowledge and inspiration. Beatrice found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, sharing observations and asking questions without the usual self-consciousness that plague her social interactions. James, in turn, proved to be an engaging conversationalist who treated her opinions with respect and encouraged her intellectual curiosity rather than dismissing it as unfeminine. "You have quite remarkable knowledge of architectural history," he observed as their discussion ranged from Gothic cathedrals to Palladian villas. "Have you had opportunity to study the subject formally?" "Only through private reading and observation," Beatrice admitted with a laugh that held notes of frustration. "Ladies are not encouraged to pursue such interests seriously. My education focused primarily on accomplishments deemed suitable for attracting a husband: watercolor painting, musical performance, and French conversation. A waste of obvious intellectual gifts," James said with such genuine indignation that Beatrice felt her heart skip. "Intelligence and curiosity should be nurtured regardless of gender. Some of the most insightful observations about architectural beauty I have encountered came from women who approach buildings without the prejudices of formal training. The radical suggestion that our mind might be valuable in its own right, rather than merely decorative, hit Beatrice with the force of revelation. She had spent so many years accepting society's verdict that her intellectual interests were unfeminine quirks to be suppressed, that hearing them praised felt like discovering a new language. As their consultation drew toward its natural conclusion, James gathered his drawings with obvious reluctance to end their conversation. "Your Grace," he said as he prepared to take his leave, "I hope I might present detailed proposals for your father's consideration within the week. This morning's discussion has provided invaluable insight into the family's aesthetic preferences and the historical significance of the estate. I would be most interested to see your final designs," Beatrice replied, then added with unexpected boldness, "Perhaps father would permit my continued involvement in reviewing the proposals. My familiarity with the grounds might prove useful." "I would welcome your input," James said with warmth that seemed to encompass more than merely professional courtesy. "Your observations about the relationship between architecture and landscape demonstrate genuine understanding of design principles." As he bowed and prepared to leave, Beatrice felt an unexpected pang of loss. Their conversation had been the most intellectually satisfying and personally affirming experience she had enjoyed in months, perhaps years. "Mr. Worthington," she called as he reached the door, "I hope you will not think me forward, but do you believe that beauty truly exists independent of society's standards?" James paused, turning back to meet her eyes with an expression of complete sincerity. "Your Grace, I believe that authentic beauty, in architecture, in nature, in people, cannot be constrained by arbitrary rules or fashionable opinions. It exists in harmony, proportion, and truth to one's essential nature. Society standards are merely temporary fashion." Long after he had gone, Beatrice remained in the morning room, staring out at the gardens that would soon be transformed by his vision and talent. For the first time in her adult life, she had encountered a man who valued her thoughts, respected her intelligence, and saw beauty in authenticity rather than conformity. The contrast with this evening's obligation to charm Lord Blackwood through submission and self-denial could not have been more profound. As afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, Beatrice began to understand that she faced a choice between two entirely different futures, one of resignation to society's limitations, and another that might require courage she was not certain she possessed. But for the first time since her father's ultimatum, she felt the stirring of genuine hope rather than mere desperate defiance. The Worthington Ball was London society's most anticipated event of the autumn season, held annually in the family's magnificent Grosvenor Square mansion. As Beatrice's carriage approached the brightly lit facade, she could see the cream of aristocratic society ascending the marble steps in their finest evening attire, the ladies resplendent in silk and jewels, the gentlemen cutting elegant figures in their black evening coats and pristine white cravats. Inside the carriage, the atmosphere was thick with tension and unspoken dread. The Duke sat opposite Beatrice, his expression stern with paternal authority, while Catherine occupied the seat beside her, radiating disapproval despite her sweet perfume and glittering sapphires. "Remember," the Duke said as their carriage joined the queue of vehicles depositing guests, "Lord Blackwood has expressed serious interest in your hand. You will conduct yourself with appropriate gratitude and compliance. No intellectual displays, no opinions about architecture or literature, and certainly no mention of your unconventional interests." Beatrice smoothed the emerald silk of her gown, which Catherine had insisted be altered with additional draping designed to minimize her figure. The result made her feel like a badly wrapped package, hidden beneath layers of fabric that whispered society's judgment with every movement. "And smile, darling," Catherine added with false sweetness. "A perpetual frown is so aging, and at your age, every year shows terribly." The familiar sting of criticism washed over Beatrice, but tonight it felt different somehow. James Worthington's words from their morning consultation echoed in her mind. Authentic beauty could not be constrained by arbitrary rules or fashionable opinions. Perhaps it was time to test the truth of that philosophy. As they alighted from the carriage, Beatrice caught sight of a familiar figure among the architectural details she had discussed with James that morning. He stood near the entrance, greeting guests with his sister and brother-in-law, his evening attire impeccable but understated compared to the ostentatious display favored by most of society's gentlemen. Their eyes met briefly across the bustling courtyard, and James offered a subtle nod of recognition that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. The knowledge that he was present somehow made the evening's ordeal feel more bearable. The Worthington Ballroom was a masterpiece of Georgian elegance, with soaring ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers, walls lined with gilt mirrors, and French doors opening onto moonlit terraces. The polished marble floor reflected the light of hundreds of candles, creating an atmosphere of magical splendor that should have lifted Beatrice's spirits. Instead, she felt like a condemned prisoner entering the execution chamber. "Ah, there he is," the Duke murmured with satisfaction, nodding toward a figure near the refreshment tables. "Lord Blackwood appears to be in excellent spirits this evening." Beatrice followed her father's gaze and felt her stomach clench with revulsion. Lord Blackwood was a man whose appearance matched his reputation for cruelty, thin, pale, with cold gray eyes and the kind of smile that never reached his face. At 62, He possessed the predatory stillness of a spider waiting for prey to stumble into his web. He was engaged in conversation with several other gentlemen, but his attention seemed focused on surveying the young ladies present with the calculating gaze of a buyer evaluating livestock. When his eyes found Beatrice, his smile widened with unmistakable satisfaction. "Your Grace," came a smooth, cultured voice behind her. Beatrice turned to find Lord Blackwood approaching, having apparently abandoned his previous conversation the moment he spotted her arrival. "How enchanting you look this evening. The emerald silk is most becoming." His eyes lingered on the neckline of her gown with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Up close, Lord Blackwood exuded an aura of barely controlled violence beneath his polished manners, the kind of man who viewed women as possessions to be acquired and controlled. "Lord Blackwood," Beatrice replied with the courtesy demanded by her breeding, despite every instinct screaming for her to flee. "I trust you are enjoying the evening's festivities." "Indeed," he replied, moving closer than propriety strictly allowed. "Though I confess my enjoyment has increased dramatically since your arrival. Might I hope you will honor me with a dance later this evening? I am most eager to continue our acquaintance." The word acquaintance carried implications that made Beatrice's skin crawl, but before she could formulate a response, the Duke intervened with barely concealed delight. "Lord Blackwood, what a pleasure to see you again. I believe Beatrice will be delighted to dance with you. Would you not, my dear?" The expectation was clear: refuse and face her father's immediate wrath, followed by social exile. Accept and endure Lord Blackwood's attentions with gracious submission. There seemed to be no third option. "Of course," Beatrice murmured, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Excellent," Lord Blackwood purred, his cold fingers closing around her gloved hand in a grip that was possessive rather than courteous. "Shall we say the second waltz? It will give us opportunity for private conversation." As Lord Blackwood moved away to secure their dance on his card, Beatrice felt the walls of her limited world closing in with suffocating finality. Around her, the ball continued in its glittering splendor, but she felt isolated by the knowledge of what this evening represented: the end of any hope for genuine happiness. "Beatrice," Catherine whispered urgently, "you must make more effort to appear pleased by Lord Blackwood's attention. Your expression suggests you are attending a funeral rather than receiving the honor of his interest." Before Beatrice could respond, the orchestra began the evening's first set, and couples moved onto the dance floor in a rustling symphony of silk and satin. She watched the dancers with a mixture of longing and despair, remembering when balls had represented possibility rather than entrapment. "Your Grace," came a familiar voice at her elbow. Beatrice turned to find James Worthington offering a respectful bow, his presence like a beacon of hope in her evening of dread. "Might I request the honor of this dance? I believe it is a country dance, which allows for conversation." The request was so unexpected that Beatrice nearly laughed with relief. Here was an opportunity to escape, however briefly, the suffocating atmosphere of her family's expectations. "Mr. Worthington," Catherine intervened with alarm. "Surely Lord Blackwood has prior claim to her Grace's attentions this evening." Lord Blackwood reserved the second waltz. James replied with polite firmness. "This is merely the opening country dance. Surely there can be no objection to her Grace participating in the general festivities." The Duke, overhearing the exchange, nodded approval. Indeed, it would be discourteous for Beatrice to refuse dancing altogether. "Mr. Worthington, you may escort my daughter for the country dance." As James offered his arm, Beatrice felt a flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with social duty and everything to do with the genuine pleasure of his company. His touch through her gloves was warm and reassuring, entirely different from Lord Blackwood's possessive grip. The country dance was an intricate pattern that required partners to move apart and together in prescribed formations, allowing for brief conversations during the moments when they were paired. As they took their positions, Beatrice found herself grateful for the complexity of the dance, which required concentration and left little opportunity for self-consciousness about her appearance. "Your Grace appears somewhat troubled this evening," James observed during their first passage together. "I hope our architectural consultation did not cause any family discord." "On the contrary," Beatrice replied as they separated for a turn with other partners, "your visit was the highlight of my day." When they came together again, James's expression had grown more serious. "I could not help but notice Lord Blackwood's particular attention to you this evening. His reputation is exactly what you might suspect," Beatrice finished quietly as they executed a complex turn. "Father has arranged my engagement to him. Tonight's dance is merely the formal beginning of my capitulation." The frank admission shocked even her with its boldness, but something about James's presence encouraged honesty over the careful facades she usually maintained. "Surely you cannot be serious," James said, his voice tight with concern as they moved through another pattern. Lord Blackwood's treatment of his previous wives was scandalous. Society tolerated his behavior only because of his title and wealth, which makes him an appropriate match for a woman who has failed to secure better offers, Beatrice replied with bitter humor. "My father considers it a fair exchange. Lord Blackwood's willingness to overlook my deficiencies in return for my dowry and connections." As the dance continued, James seemed to be wrestling with some internal decision. During their final passage together, he leaned close enough that his words were audible to her alone. "Your Grace," he said urgently, "there are always alternatives for those brave enough to pursue them. You possess intelligence, strength, and genuine beauty that has nothing to do with society's narrow definitions. Do not let fear trap you in a future you do not choose." Before Beatrice could respond, the dance concluded, and James was escorting her back to her family's position near the refreshment tables. The Duke and Catherine were engaged in animated conversation with several other couples, but their attention immediately focused on Beatrice's return. "How delightful!" Catherine gushed with false enthusiasm. "Mr. Worthington, you dance beautifully. I do hope you enjoyed partnering with our dear Beatrice." "Her Grace is an accomplished dancer," James replied diplomatically, "and a fascinating conversationalist. You must be very proud of her many talents." The compliment was so genuine and unexpected that Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. When had anyone last praised her talents rather than lamenting her failures? "Yes, quite," the Duke replied absently, his attention already focused on Lord Blackwood's approach for the promised waltz. "Beatrice, Lord Blackwood is coming to claim his dance. Remember what we discussed." As James bowed and withdrew, Beatrice felt as if she were watching a lifeline disappear beneath dark water. Lord Blackwood's presence seemed to dim the ballroom's brilliance, his cold smile promising a future of submission and fear. "My dear Duchess," he said, offering his arm with proprietary confidence, "I have been counting the minutes until our waltz. I confess myself eager for private conversation." The waltz was an intimate dance, requiring partners to stand close together while moving through sweeping turns around the ballroom floor. In Lord Blackwood's arms, Beatrice felt trapped rather than graceful, his grip on her waist possessive and his conversation a catalog of expectations for their future marriage. "I have already begun arranging details for our wedding," he murmured as they swept past the French doors leading to the moonlit terraces. "A quiet ceremony, I think, befitting a mature bride entering her second chance at matrimony." The assumption that she had already accepted his proposal made Beatrice's blood boil, but she forced herself to maintain appropriate composure. "The arrangements for the estate are quite advanced," Lord Blackwood continued, his cold eyes fixed on her face as if memorizing his future possession. "My previous wives found the isolation conducive to proper feminine behavior. I trust you will appreciate the tranquility." The threat beneath his polite words was unmistakable. Isolation meant no witnesses to whatever proper feminine behavior entailed, no family or friends to notice if she suffered the same mysterious fate as his previous wives. As they turned past the orchestra, Beatrice caught sight of James Worthington standing near the terrace doors, his expression tense with concern as he watched her dance with Lord Blackwood. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw in his gaze a mixture of sympathy and something deeper, a recognition of shared understanding that transcended social conventions. "You seem distracted, my dear," Lord Blackwood observed with displeasure. "I trust you understand the importance of focused attention to your future husband's conversation." "Forgive me," Beatrice replied, forcing her attention back to her dance partner. "I was simply admiring the beauty of the ballroom." "Soon you will have little occasion for such distractions," Lord Blackwood said with satisfaction. "Country life provides few opportunities for wandering attention." The waltz seemed to last forever, each turn carrying Beatrice deeper into despair as Lord Blackwood outlined his expectations for their marriage. By the time the music concluded, she felt physically ill from the combination of his suffocating cologne and the growing certainty that she was about to be trapped in a union that would destroy her spirit if it did not kill her outright. "Thank you for the dance," she managed as he escorted her back to her family. "It was instructive." "Indeed," Lord Blackwood replied with cold satisfaction. "I believe we understand each other perfectly. I shall call upon your father tomorrow to formalize arrangements." As he moved away, Beatrice felt the last of her hope crumble. Tomorrow would bring her formal engagement to a man who viewed her as property to be acquired and controlled. The life she had imagined, one of intellectual companionship, genuine affection, and mutual respect, would become forever impossible. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and appropriate responses to congratulations from acquaintances who had somehow learned of her impending engagement. Word traveled quickly through London society, and by the final set of dances, Beatrice felt like an exhibit in a museum, the failed spinster who had finally accepted her fate. During the carriage ride home, Catherine chatted excitedly about wedding preparations while the Duke expressed satisfaction with the evening's success. Neither seemed to notice Beatrice's silence or the way she stared out at the darkened London streets as if seeing them for the last time. It was only when they reached Pemberton House that she realized James Worthington's words had taken root in her heart. There were always alternatives for those brave enough to pursue them. The question was whether she possessed the courage to transform desperation into action, or whether she would submit to the fate that society had chosen for her. As she climbed the stairs to her chamber, Beatrice began to understand that her choice was not merely between Lord Blackwood and spinsterhood, but between two entirely different ways of living. As a victim of circumstances, or as the author of her own story. The decision would require courage she was not certain she possessed, but for the first time in her adult life, she felt the stirring of genuine defiance rather than mere resignation. Dawn broke over London with unusual brilliance, painting the autumn sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to mock Beatrice's internal turmoil. She had spent the night pacing her chamber, alternating between desperate plans for escape and resigned acceptance of her fate. Lord Blackwood's formal proposal would arrive within hours, and her father would accept it with the ruthless efficiency of a man conducting a business transaction. Mrs. Clark found her mistress standing at the window in her nightgown, dark circles beneath her eyes and her hair falling in unbound waves around her shoulders. "Your Grace," the older woman said gently, "you must rest. The morning post will bring what it will, but you cannot face the day in such a state." "I cannot marry him, Margaret," Beatrice said quietly, using her lady's maid's first name with the intimacy reserved for moments of deepest despair. "I would rather die than submit to that man's cruelties, but I see no alternative that does not bring ruin upon my family's name." Mrs. Clark approached the window, studying her mistress's face with the concern of someone who had watched her grow from a spirited child into a woman crushed by society's expectations. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "there are always alternatives, though they may require sacrificing some comforts and conventions. A woman of intelligence and determination can create opportunities that society claims do not exist." Before Beatrice could ask what she meant, The sound of an arriving carriage drew their attention to the street below. But instead of Lord Blackwood's elaborate equipage, they saw a modest but well-appointed vehicle from which James Worthington emerged, carrying what appeared to be a portfolio of architectural drawings. "Mr. Worthington," Beatrice breathed, feeling her pulse quicken with an emotion she dared not name. But surely father did not schedule another consultation so early in the morning. Mrs. Clark's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Perhaps the gentleman has other purposes besides architecture, Your Grace. I observe his attention to you quite carefully during last evening's ball." The implication sent a flutter through Beatrice's chest. Could it be possible that James Worthington's interest extended beyond professional courtesy or casual friendship? The thought seemed too wonderful to credit. Yet his presence at such an unusual hour suggested urgency that had little to do with garden renovations. 20 minutes later, after hastily dressing in a morning gown of soft blue muslin, Beatrice found herself once again in the morning room, her heart racing with anticipation and fear in equal measure. When James entered, she was struck by the tension in his bearing and the intensity of his amber eyes. "Your Grace," he said, bowing with his usual courtesy, but remaining standing rather than taking the seat she offered. "I must apologize for calling at such an early hour, but I find myself compelled by circumstances that will not wait for conventional visiting times." "Mr. Worthington," Beatrice replied, noting the strain in his voice, "you appear troubled. Has something occurred regarding the architectural commission?" James moved to the window, then turned back to face her with an expression of barely controlled emotion. "Your Grace, I must speak plainly, though doing so may exceed the bounds of propriety and professional courtesy." The formal words seemed to struggle against more passionate impulses, and Beatrice felt her breath catch in anticipation of whatever revelation he was about to make. "Last evening," James continued, his voice gaining strength, "I watched you dance with Lord Blackwood and saw in your face an expression of such despair that I could not sleep for thinking of it. I have spent the night walking London streets, wrestling with questions of honor, duty, and the rights of one human being to intervene in another's fate." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that spoke of deep agitation. "I have no right to interfere in arrangements made by your family. I am a man who earns his living through trade, possessed of no title or great fortune. By every measure society values, I am utterly unsuitable as a suitor for a duchess." Beatrice felt her heart begin to race as she grasped the direction of his words. "Mr. Worthington, please," he interrupted gently, "allow me to finish before I lose the courage that brought me here. Yesterday morning, when we discussed architecture and beauty, I found myself in the presence of a woman whose intelligence, kindness, and genuine spirit exceeded anything I had ever encountered. Your conversation revealed a mind unafraid of complex ideas and a heart capable of deep feeling." James moved closer, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. "I cannot claim to offer you the material advantages that Lord Blackwood possesses," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I cannot provide a title or a grand estate or the kind of luxury you have known since birth. But I can offer you something I believe he never could: genuine love, respect for your intelligence, and a partnership based on mutual admiration rather than possession." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Beatrice had been taught about marriage, duty, and social expectations. Here was a man offering her exactly what she had never dared to hope for: love without conditions, respect without reservations, and acceptance of her authentic self. "You are asking me to choose," she said softly, hardly daring to believe that such a choice was actually being offered. "I am asking you to consider an alternative to resignation," James replied, moving close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes. "Your Grace, Beatrice, I am asking if you could find it possible to care for a man who values your mind as much as your beauty, who sees your spirit as your greatest treasure. The use of her first name sent a shock through her entire being. In a world where even married couples often maintained formal address, such intimacy was profoundly significant. But the scandal, Beatrice whispered, her practical mind finally catching up with her racing heart. My family would be ruined. You would be destroyed professionally. Society would never accept such a union. James reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw, and took her hands in his own. His touch was warm and strong, entirely different from Lord Blackwood's cold possession or the countless impersonal contacts she endured in social situations. Society's acceptance matters less than living with honor and authenticity, he said firmly. I have observed the ton carefully, Beatrice. They respect success and determination more than they admit. If we face their disapproval together, with dignity and courage, we might find more allies than enemies. And if we do not, she asked, though her hands remained in his, drawing strength from his touch, then we will create our own world. James replied with conviction that took her breath away. I have commissions in Yorkshire, Scotland, even possibilities in America. There are places where a man's worth is measured by his character and accomplishments rather than his pedigree, where a woman's intelligence is valued rather than hidden. The vision he painted was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, a life beyond the suffocating conventions of London society, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. It would mean abandoning everything familiar, but gaining something she had never believed possible. James, she said, testing the intimacy of his name on her tongue. What you offer sounds like a dream from a novel rather than a practical possibility. Yesterday morning, he replied, lifting one of her hands to his lips in a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. You taught me that authentic beauty exists independent of society's arbitrary standards. Today, I am asking you to help me prove that authentic love can triumph over social conventions. Before Beatrice could respond, the sound of voices in the hallway announced the arrival of other members of the household. James immediately stepped back, releasing her hands with obvious reluctance, but his eyes remained fixed on her face with hopeful intensity. I do not expect an immediate answer, he said quietly as footsteps approached the morning room. But I needed you to know that alternatives exist, that you are valued for who you truly are, and that someone believes you deserve happiness rather than mere duty. The door opened to admit the Duke, who appeared surprised to find James present at such an early hour. Mr. Worthington, the Duke said with polite confusion, I was not expecting another consultation this morning. Has some urgent matter arisen regarding the estate renovations? Indeed, Your Grace, James replied smoothly, his professional demeanor sliding into place like a well-worn mask. I discovered several historical precedents for the garden improvements that I thought might interest Her Grace, given her knowledge of architectural history. I took the liberty of calling early, knowing that such research is best discussed while the morning light is favorable for examining detailed drawings. The explanation was plausible enough to satisfy the Duke's curiosity, though Beatrice noticed James's hands trembled slightly as he gathered his papers. The evidence of his emotional state beneath his composed exterior made her heart ache with recognition of the courage his proposal had required. Quite right, the Duke agreed, moving to examine the drawings James spread across the table. Beatrice, I trust Mr. Worthington's historical research proved enlightening? Extremely so, Father, Beatrice managed, proud of the steadiness in her voice despite the turmoil in her chest. Mr. Worthington's knowledge of architectural precedents is truly remarkable. As James took his leave with appropriate professional courtesy, his eyes met hers one final time, conveying a message that needed no words. The choice was hers, but she was not alone in facing it. After the morning room door closed behind him, Beatrice stood in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the space of a few minutes, her understanding of possibility had been completely transformed. The young man seems quite dedicated to his craft, the Duke observed, studying the architectural drawings James had left behind. These historical precedents show considerable research. I believe his work will reflect quite favorably on the Pemberton estate. If only he knew, Beatrice thought with a mixture of hysteria and hope, that Mr. Worthington's dedication extended far beyond architectural commissions. The remainder of the morning passed in a blur of ordinary activities that felt surreal given the extraordinary choice now before her. Catherine fussed over wedding preparations, assuming Beatrice's silence indicated proper feminine submission rather than revolutionary contemplation. The Duke reviewed correspondence from Lord Blackwood's solicitors, already negotiating the financial terms of the engagement settlement. Meanwhile, Beatrice moved through familiar routines while her mind raced through the implications of James's proposal. To accept meant abandoning her title, her family, her entire social world. It meant facing scandal, gossip, and possible exile from everything she had ever known. But it also meant the possibility of genuine love, intellectual companionship, and a life lived according to her own values rather than society's expectations. For the first time in her adult life, she faced a choice that was truly her own to make. As afternoon arrived, bringing with it the formal delivery of Lord Blackwood's marriage proposal, Beatrice understood that her decision would define not merely her future happiness, but her very identity. Would she remain Lady Beatrice Pemberton, dutiful daughter who sacrificed her spirit for family honor? Or would she become simply Beatrice, a woman brave enough to choose love over security, authenticity over acceptance? The answer lay not in her head, where duty and fear resided, but in her heart, where hope had taken root despite years of disappointment. As she held Lord Blackwood's formal proposal in her hands, Beatrice began to understand that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. James Worthington had offered her more than marriage. He had offered her the chance to discover who she might become when freed from the constraints of others' expectations. The question now was whether she possessed the strength to reach for that freedom, knowing that once grasped, there would be no turning back. The clock in the morning room chimed the hour, marking time that seemed both endless and desperately short. Soon, very soon, she would have to choose between the life she had always known and the life she had never dared to dream possible. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows of Pemberton House seemed different somehow, as if the very air had been transformed by the morning's revelations. Beatrice sat in her private sitting room. Lord Blackwood's formal marriage proposal spread before her on the delicate writing desk, its elaborate calligraphy and legal terminology a stark reminder of the trap that was closing around her life. The document was precisely what she had expected, a cold, businesslike arrangement that detailed financial settlements, property transfers, and Lord Blackwood's expectations for her conduct as his wife. There was no mention of affection, compatibility, or mutual respect, only the mechanics of acquisition and control. Mrs. Clark entered quietly, carrying the afternoon tea service, but her usual efficiency was tempered by obvious concern for her mistress's state of mind. "Your Grace," she said softly, setting the silver tray on a side table, "the Duke requests your presence in the library at 4 o'clock. Lord Blackwood has arrived to receive your formal acceptance of his proposal." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of panic that threatened to overwhelm Beatrice's fragile composure. In less than an hour, she would be expected to commit herself to a future that filled her with dread, speaking words that would seal her fate as irrevocably as any legal contract. "Margaret," Beatrice said quietly, using her lady's maid's first name as she had that morning, "what would you do if faced with a choice between duty and happiness, security and freedom?" The older woman paused in her arrangements, studying Beatrice's face with the wisdom born of decades of observing human nature. "Your Grace," she replied carefully, "I have seen many young ladies sacrifice their hearts for security, and I have watched them wither like flowers denied sunlight. Money and position cannot compensate for the death of one's spirit. But the consequences of choosing otherwise, are uncertain, Mrs. Clark finished gently. But uncertainty is not the same as disaster. A woman of your intelligence and strength might find that the world offers more possibilities than society admits. Before Beatrice could respond, the sound of voices in the hallway announced new arrivals. Through her sitting room window, she could see a modest carriage in the courtyard below, from which two figures emerged, James Worthington and an elegantly dressed woman she did not recognize. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and terror. Had James come to press his suit more formally? Was he prepared to make his intentions known to her father, despite the social impossibility of such a match? 20 minutes later, a soft knock at her door announced the arrival of one of the household maids with an unusual message. "Your Grace," the young woman said with barely concealed excitement, "there's a lady downstairs asking to speak with you privately. She says she's Mrs. Eleanor Worthington, and it's a matter of urgent importance regarding your future happiness." James's sister. Beatrice felt her pulse quicken with anticipation and apprehension in equal measure. What could Lady Worthington possibly want to discuss that related to her future happiness? "Please show Mrs. Worthington to the morning room," Beatrice instructed, her decision made before conscious thought could intervene. "And inform Father that I am indisposed and will join him in the library presently." 5 minutes later, Beatrice found herself face to face with Eleanor Worthington, a woman whose elegance and poise immediately explained her successful marriage into London's upper circles. At perhaps 35, Eleanor possessed the kind of understated beauty that came from confidence and intelligence rather than mere physical perfection. "Your Grace," Eleanor said with a warm smile that immediately put Beatrice at ease, "I must apologize for calling without proper introduction, but my brother's happiness, and yours, seem to require immediate action." "Mrs. Worthington," Beatrice replied, gesturing for her guest to be seated, "I confess myself curious about any matter that concerns both your brother's happiness and my own." Eleanor settled into her chair with graceful composure, studying Beatrice with obvious approval. "James came to me this morning in a state of considerable agitation, having apparently made a declaration that goes far beyond conventional social boundaries. He described a young woman of exceptional intelligence and character who faces an intolerable choice between duty and authenticity." The frank acknowledgement of the morning's events sent heat flooding through Beatrice's cheeks, but Eleanor's manner encouraged honesty rather than embarrassment. "Your brother has offered me an alternative I never dared to imagine possible," Beatrice admitted. "But the practical obstacles seem insurmountable. A duchess who abandons her family and station to marry a tradesman would face complete social exile." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied with a knowing smile. "Or perhaps she would discover that society's rules are more flexible than they appear, especially when challenged by people of determination and character." "You speak as someone with experience in such matters." Eleanor's laugh was musical and genuine. "My dear, I married a man whose family fortune came from textile manufacturing rather than inherited estates. Society predicted our complete ruin, but we have found acceptance based on our conduct rather than our pedigree. James possesses talents that make him valuable to people who matter, and you have qualities that transcend any title." The suggestion that social exile might not be inevitable sent a flutter of hope through Beatrice's chest. "But surely the circumstances are different. Your husband's family had wealth, even if not ancient lineage." "True," Eleanor acknowledged, "but James has something more valuable than inherited wealth: the ability to create beauty and value through his own skills. His architectural commissions are sought after throughout England, and his reputation grows stronger each year. A wife who supported his work while contributing her own intelligence and social skills could help build something more lasting than any inherited fortune." The vision Eleanor painted was compelling. A partnership of equals, building success through shared effort rather than simply inheriting position. But Beatrice's practical mind continued to wrestle with the obstacles. Even if society eventually accepted such a union, she said carefully. There would be immediate consequences. My family would be disgraced, James's professional relationships might suffer, and we would face financial uncertainty while building a new life. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. Your Grace, may I speak to you as one woman to another, setting aside all considerations of rank and protocol. Beatrice nodded, drawn by the sincerity in Eleanor's voice. I have watched James work with dedication and passion for years, but I have never seen him as animated as he was this morning when describing your conversation about architecture and beauty. He has found in you not merely a woman he desires, but an intellectual companion who understands his deepest interests and ambitions. Eleanor paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. Similarly, from what I observed of your behavior at last evening's ball, you have found in James something equally rare, a man who values your mind as much as your person, who sees strength where others see defiance. The accuracy of Eleanor's assessment took Beatrice's breath away. In their brief conversations, James had indeed seen and appreciated aspects of her personality that her own family dismissed as unfortunate quirks. But Lord Blackwood's proposal, Beatrice began, then stopped as Eleanor's expression grew dark with concern, is tantamount to a death sentence. Eleanor finished bluntly. His treatment of his previous wives was notorious among those who cared to pay attention. Choosing him would represent not duty, but self-destruction. The stark assessment matched Beatrice's own fears so precisely that tears sprang to her eyes. Here was confirmation from someone outside her immediate circle that her dread of Lord Blackwood was justified rather than merely feminine hysteria. Then you believe I should accept your brother's proposal? Beatrice asked, hardly daring to voice the question that had consumed her thoughts. I believe, Eleanor replied carefully, that you should choose the future that allows you to become the woman you are meant to be rather than the one society has chosen for you. James offers you partnership, respect, and the chance to build something meaningful together. Lord Blackwood offers you compliance until death. The choice, when framed so starkly, seemed almost absurdly simple. Yet Beatrice knew that the practical consequences of choosing love over duty would be immediate and severe. There would need to be a plan, she said slowly, her mind beginning to work through the logistics of such a momentous decision. Simply eloping would create maximum scandal while providing minimum security. Eleanor's smile suggested she had been hoping for exactly this kind of practical thinking. James has already begun considering such matters. His architectural practice could be transferred to Edinburgh, where his reputation is well established and society is somewhat more accepting of merit over birth. Alternatively, he has received offers to work in America, where such distinctions matter even less. The mention of Edinburgh and America sent a thrill of possibility through Beatrice's imagination. She had dreamed of seeing the world beyond London's restrictive society, of encountering people who valued intelligence and character over arbitrary social rules. And in the immediate term, she asked, her heartbeat accelerating as the conversation moved from theoretical to practical. A private ceremony could be arranged within days, Eleanor replied. James has connections among the clergy who would perform the service quietly. Once you are legally married, your father's authority over your future would be ended, though his displeasure would undoubtedly be considerable. The timeline was breathtakingly rapid, but Beatrice recognized the wisdom in swift action. Every day of delay increased the risk of her father completing arrangements with Lord Blackwood that would be difficult to reverse. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation, followed by the entrance of a housemaid with a message that sent ice through Beatrice's veins. Your Grace, the young woman said nervously. His Grace requests your immediate presence in the library. Lord Blackwood is becoming impatient for your response to his proposal. Eleanor rose immediately, understanding that the moment of decision had arrived sooner than expected. Your Grace, she said formally for the benefit of the servant, I hope you will consider my invitation to visit our estate in Yorkshire. The change of scenery might prove enlightening. The coded language conveyed her message clearly. The alternative Eleanor and James offered remained available, but only if Beatrice possessed the courage to seize it. As Eleanor departed, Beatrice stood in her morning room, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders. In the library below, Lord Blackwood waited for her formal acceptance of his proposal, while her father prepared to celebrate the conclusion of a transaction that would solve his daughter's embarrassing failure to secure an appropriate husband. But Eleanor's visit had crystallized something that had been forming in Beatrice's mind since James's morning declaration. The recognition that she faced a choice between two entirely different definitions of honor. Society defined honor as obedience to family and social expectations, regardless of personal cost. But perhaps true honor lay in authenticity, in the courage to live according to one's deepest values rather than external pressures. As she prepared to descend to the library, Beatrice understood that she was about to define not merely her future, but her essential character. Would she be remembered as the dutiful daughter who sacrificed her happiness for family reputation, or as the woman who chose love over fear, authenticity over acceptance? The clock on the mantel chimed 4 o'clock, its measured tones marking the end of one chapter of her life and the potential beginning of another. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether that new chapter would be written in her own hand or dictated by others' expectations. Taking a deep breath that felt like the first full breath she had drawn in years, Beatrice smoothed her skirts and prepared to face her destiny with whatever courage she could summon. The girl who had accepted society's limitations was about to discover what kind of woman she might become when freed from those constraints. The door to the library, and to her future, awaited her decision. The library of Pemberton House had always been Beatrice's sanctuary, its floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound volumes representing centuries of human knowledge and imagination. But as she approached the mahogany doors, the familiar space felt more like a courtroom where her fate would be decided by judges who had already reached their verdict. Through the partially open door, she could hear voices, her father's measured tones, Lord Blackwood's cultured drawl, and the occasional murmur from Catherine. They were discussing her future with the detached efficiency of men negotiating the sale of livestock, and the knowledge that she was expected to participate in her own commodification filled her with a rage so pure it startled her with its intensity. For 23 years, she had accepted society's judgment that her worth lay entirely in her ability to secure an appropriate marriage. She had internalized the message that her intelligence was unfeminine, her curiosity inappropriate, and her appearance a shameful failure to meet arbitrary standards of beauty. But James Worthington had seen something different. A woman whose mind was her greatest asset, whose authenticity was more beautiful than any artificial conformity, whose strength of character made her worthy of genuine partnership rather than mere possession. Standing outside the library door, Beatrice felt something fundamental shift within her chest. The frightened girl who had spent years apologizing for her existence was transforming into a woman who understood her own value. She knocked firmly and entered without waiting for permission. The tableau that greeted her was exactly what she had expected. Her father seated behind his massive desk, Lord Blackwood in the chair of honor beside him, and Catherine positioned decoratively near the window like an ornamental flower. They looked up at her entrance with expressions ranging from paternal authority to predatory satisfaction. "Ah, Beatrice," the Duke said with unusual warmth, "we have been discussing the details of your engagement to Lord Blackwood. I trust you are prepared to express appropriate gratitude for his generous offer." Lord Blackwood rose with theatrical gallantry, his cold eyes fixed on her face as if he could will her into submission through sheer force of expectation. "My dear Duchess," he purred, "I have been eagerly awaiting your formal acceptance of my proposal. I confess myself most anxious to begin our courtship in earnest." The word courtship was laughable, given that he had already begun planning their wedding without her consent. But Beatrice recognized the performance for what it was, a show of romantic propriety designed to mask the business transaction beneath. "Lord Blackwood," she replied with perfect composure, "your proposal has indeed given me much to consider." Something in her tone must have alerted her father to potential trouble, because his expression grew sharp with warning. "Beatrice, I trust your considerations have led you to the appropriate conclusion. Lord Blackwood has been most generous in overlooking the unusual circumstances of your situation." The veiled reference to her failure to secure other suitors was intended to remind her of her limited options. But instead of feeling shame, Beatrice felt her resolve strengthen. She was done allowing others to define her worth. "Father," she said clearly, "I have indeed reached a conclusion about my future. However, it is not the one you expect." The silence that followed her words was profound enough to hear the ticking of the mantel clock. Lord Blackwood's expression began to shift from confident satisfaction to something more dangerous. "I cannot accept Lord Blackwood's proposal," Beatrice continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "because I have come to understand that marriage should be based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than mere convenience or desperation." The Duke's face flushed with anger. "Beatrice, you forget yourself. Lord Blackwood has offered you an opportunity that your circumstances hardly warrant. You will accept his proposal and express proper gratitude for his consideration." "I will not," Beatrice replied with calm finality that surprised even her. "I will not marry a man whose reputation for cruelty is well documented, whose previous wives died under mysterious circumstances, and who views me as property to be acquired rather than a person to be cherished." Lord Blackwood's mask of genteel courtesy finally slipped, revealing the cold fury beneath. "Your Grace," he said with menacing softness, "I fear your romantic notions have clouded your judgment. Perhaps a period of reflection in more controlled circumstances would help clarify your thinking." The threat was unmistakable, and for a moment, Beatrice felt her courage waver. Lord Blackwood possessed the power to make her life extremely difficult, and her father's alliance with him could result in complete social exile. But before fear could reclaim its hold over her heart, the library door opened to admit an unexpected figure, James Worthington, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of quiet determination. "Your Grace," he said to the Duke, bowing respectfully despite the obvious tension in the room, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have urgent architectural matters to discuss that cannot await a more convenient time." The Duke's confusion was evident. "Mr. Worthington, this is hardly an appropriate moment for business discussions. As you can see, we are engaged in family matters of considerable importance." "Indeed," James replied, his eyes meeting Beatrice's briefly before returning to her father. "My business relates directly to those family matters. I have come to formally request permission to pay court to Her Grace with the intention of honorable marriage." The statement fell into the room like a thunderbolt, instantly transforming the atmosphere from tense negotiation to something approaching chaos. Catherine gasped audibly. The Duke's face cycled through several shades of purple, and Lord Blackwood's expression grew murderous. "Impossible," the Duke sputtered. "Absolutely impossible. You are a tradesman, sir, however well-connected your family. My daughter is a duchess, heir to one of England's oldest titles. Such a union is utterly inappropriate." "With respect, Your Grace," James replied calmly, "your daughter is a remarkable woman whose intelligence, kindness, and strength of character make her worthy of any man's deepest devotion. I may lack a title, but I possess skills, prospects, and above all, genuine love and respect for Lady Beatrice." "Love?" Lord Blackwood spat with contempt. "What has love to do with marriage among people of quality? This architect offers your daughter nothing but sentiment and uncertainty." "He offers me partnership," Beatrice said, finding her voice again as courage flowed back in her heart. "He values my mind, respects my opinions, and sees beauty in my authentic self rather than demanding conformity to arbitrary standards. James moved closer, his presence lending her strength. Your Grace, he addressed her father formally. I understand that my suit may seem presumptuous, but I have commissions that provide substantial income, prospects for advancement, and opportunities for travel and growth. I can offer your daughter a life of dignity, purpose, and genuine affection. Travel, the Duke repeated with disgust. Purpose. These are not appropriate concerns for a duchess. Beatrice's duty is to marry advantageously and maintain the family honor, not to pursue romantic fantasies with someone beneath her station. Beneath her station, James repeated quietly, and Beatrice heard steel enter his voice. Your Grace, I judge worth by character, accomplishment, and integrity rather than inherited titles. By those measures, I believe myself worthy of any woman who might find value in genuine partnership rather than mere possession. Lord Blackwood stepped forward, his composure finally cracking completely. This is absurd. Pemberton, you cannot seriously consider allowing your daughter to throw herself away on a commoner. I have already made arrangements. You have made assumptions, Beatrice interrupted, her own anger finally blazing to the surface. You assumed that my desperation would overcome my judgment, that my family's pressure would force my compliance. But I am not desperate enough to accept a future of fear and probable death for the sake of maintaining appearances. The accusation hung in the air like an unsheathed sword. Catherine looked faint, the Duke appeared apoplectic, and Lord Blackwood's mask slipped entirely to reveal the predatory nature beneath. You will regret this defiance, Lord Blackwood said with quiet menace. Both of you. Society does not tolerate such irregularities without consequences. Then we will face those consequences together, James replied, moving to stand beside Beatrice in a gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than any declaration. And if necessary, we will build our lives somewhere more accepting of merit over arbitrary privilege. The Duke rose from behind his desk, his face contorted with rage and disappointment. Beatrice, if you pursue this madness, you will be cut off from family, fortune, and social position. You will have nothing but this man's uncertain prospects and society's disapproval. Beatrice looked around the library that had been her refuge, at the father who had never seen her value, at the stepmother who had never accepted her, and at the man who represented everything she despised about arranged marriage. Then she looked at James, whose amber eyes held promises of respect, partnership, and genuine love. I will have everything that matters, she said with quiet certainty. I will have authenticity instead of pretense, love instead of duty, and the chance to become who I was meant to be rather than who others have chosen for me. She moved to James's side, feeling his warmth and strength like a beacon in the storm of family disapproval. Mr. Worthington, she said formally, I accept your suit with gratitude and joy. James's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire expression. Your Grace, Beatrice, you have made me the happiest man in England. The Duke's voice, when it came, was cold as winter frost. Then you are no longer my daughter. Leave this house immediately, and do not expect recognition, support, or acknowledgement from the Pemberton family. The words struck like physical blows, but Beatrice found that they carried less pain than she had expected. The girl who had craved her father's approval was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to value herself. I understand, she replied with dignity that surprised even her. I regret your inability to accept my choice, but I will not sacrifice my happiness for the preservation of pride that has no foundation in love. As they prepared to leave the library, Lord Blackwood made one final attempt to assert control. You will both rue this day, he said with vicious satisfaction. Society will destroy you for this presumption. James turned back, his expression calm but implacable. My lord, society may disapprove, but it cannot destroy people who possess talent, determination, and genuine partnership. We will build our success on foundations more solid than inherited privilege or intimidation. 3 hours later, Beatrice stood in the modest parlor of James's lodgings, surrounded by architectural drawings and books that spoke of a life devoted to creating beauty rather than simply consuming it. Mrs. Clark had arrived with a hastily packed valise containing essential belongings, having chosen loyalty to her mistress over security with the Pemberton household. "Your Grace," Mrs. Clark said with tears in her eyes, "I pray you will not regret this choice." "I regret nothing," Beatrice replied, surprising herself with the truth of the statement. "For the first time in my life, I feel as though I am living authentically rather than performing a role." James approached carrying 2 cups of tea, his manner tender with new understanding of the enormity of what Beatrice had sacrificed for their future together. "My darling," he said softly, "I know what this decision has cost you. Your family, your position, your security have been exchanged for something far more valuable," Beatrice interrupted, taking his hand in hers. "James, you have given me something I never dared to hope for. The chance to be valued for who I truly am rather than who others expected me to become." Over the following weeks, as news of their elopement spread through London society, Beatrice discovered that James's predictions about social flexibility proved largely accurate. While some members of the ton expressed scandalized disapproval, others, particularly those who had witnessed Lord Blackwood's true nature, offered quiet support and even admiration for her courage. James's architectural practice flourished as several prominent families, impressed by his talent and integrity, commissioned major projects. His reputation for creating beauty that enhanced rather than overshadowed natural settings made him increasingly sought after among clients who valued substance over mere fashion. 6 months after their marriage, as spring returned to England, Beatrice found herself in the gardens of their new home in Edinburgh, watching James design improvements that would create intimate spaces for contemplation while maintaining the property's essential character. "Do you ever regret leaving London?" James asked as they walked among the emerging flowers, his arm around her waist in a gesture of casual affection that would have been scandalous in her previous life. Beatrice considered the question seriously, thinking of the girl who had stood at Pemberton House windows, watching life pass by while accepting that happiness was not intended for women like her. "I regret the pain our choice caused people I loved," she replied honestly. "But I cannot regret choosing authenticity over acceptance, love over duty, or partnership over possession." James stopped walking, turning to face her with an expression of such tenderness that her breath caught in her throat. "My brilliant, beautiful, courageous wife," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "You have taught me that true nobility comes from character rather than bloodline, that genuine beauty transcends arbitrary standards, and that the greatest architecture is not buildings but the life 2 people construct together." As he kissed her in the garden they were creating together, Beatrice understood that she had found something more valuable than any title or inheritance: the freedom to become herself completely, to love without reservation, and to build a future based on mutual respect rather than social expectations. The girl who had believed herself unworthy of genuine love was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had learned that worthiness was not something to be earned through compliance, but something to be claimed through courage. In choosing James, she had not diminished herself, but discovered who she had always been meant to become. And in the years that followed, as their love deepened and their shared work flourished, Beatrice would look back on that moment in her father's library and not as a rebellion against duty, but as the beginning of her authentic life, built not on society's foundations of fear and conformity, but on the solid ground of genuine partnership, mutual respect, and love that saw beauty in truth rather than pretense. The Duchess who had been scorned by society became the woman who had scorned society's limitations, and in doing so, had discovered that the most beautiful architecture of all was a life built according to one's own authentic vision rather than others' narrow blueprints. Their story became whispered legend in drawing rooms across England, proof that authentic love could triumph over social convention, that courage could transform limitation into possibility, and that sometimes the greatest act of nobility was refusing to accept the life that others had chosen for you. In the end, Beatrice had learned the most important lesson of all, that beauty, love, and worth existed independent of society's approval, and that the courage to claim them was the greatest inheritance anyone could possess.